The wind that came down from the mountains in the winter of 1887 carried the bite of iron and the memory of a world without men. It scoured the single street of Raven's Ford, piling snow in silent, sleeping drifts against the false fronts of the general store and the land office. It howled across the frozen expanse of the river, a mournful sound that seemed to worm its way through the chinks in every log wall, a constant reminder of how small a thing a town was, how fragile the warmth of a fire. Inside the small building that served as both clinic and schoolhouse, Eliza Hart felt the cold in her bones. It was a different cold from the damp chill of Denver, a city she had left behind with its ghosts and its suffocating grief. This Montana cold was clean, sharp, and absolute. It demanded respect. She added another piece of pine to the pot-bellied stove, and the resin in the wood popped, releasing a brief, sharp fragrance that mingled with the scents of dried herbs, carbolic soap, and chalk dust. The room was her sanctuary, a place of order in a world defined by its wildness. By day, the scrawled lessons of children filled the blackboard. By night, it was a haven for the sick and the birthing. A sudden, violent rattling at the door startled her. It was not the knock of a neighbor seeking a poultice for a cough. This was a frantic, desperate sound, a fist beating against the thick wood as if to ward off the devil himself. Eliza smoothed her apron, her face composing itself into the calm mask of a medical professional, and lifted the latch. The man who stumbled in was more snow than human, a greatcoat covered in white, a scarf wrapped so high it hid all but his panicked eyes. He pulled the frozen fabric from his mouth, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over one another. A woman, he said, a birthing. She needed help, and she needed it now. Eliza reached for her worn leather bag, its contents checked and rechecked by habit. She asked where the woman was. The man's eyes shifted, avoiding her direct gaze. A camp? He mumbled. A hunting camp up the North Fork. His vagueness was a warning bell, a clear signal that this was not a simple matter of a baby coming too soon. There were trappers and hunters who worked lines they should not, men who preferred to stay clear of the town and its laws, but a woman in labor among them. That was something else entirely. It was wrong. Still, the call of her duty was stronger than the alarm ringing in her mind. A life was struggling to enter the world, and she was the only one in 50 miles with the skill to help it along. She pulled on her own heavy coat, wrapped a thick wool shawl around her head and neck, and followed the man into the roaring darkness. The storm was a living thing, a malevolent beast of wind and ice. The journey was a nightmare of plunging through drifts that were hip-deep, of shielding her face from a wind that felt like it was full of tiny knives. The man led a single horse, upon which he insisted she ride, while he walked ahead, breaking the trail. He did not speak, and the silence between them was filled by the shrieking of the wind and the labored breathing of the horse. They moved away from the faint lights of the town, pressing deeper into the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded Raven's Ford. After what felt like an eternity, a faint, flickering light appeared through the swirling snow. It came from a crude shack, little more than a lean-to built against a rock outcropping, tucked deep within a stand of lodgepole pines. It was a place meant to be hidden. The man gestured toward it, then, with a mumbled word of thanks that was stolen by the wind, he mounted his horse and disappeared back into the storm, abandoning her as completely as if he had never been there at all. For a moment, Eliza stood frozen, the wind tearing at her, a profound sense of dread washing over her. This was more than wrong. This was dangerous. But a low moan from inside the shack spurred her into action. She pushed open the rough plank door and stepped into a small, suffocating space lit by a single lantern. A young woman lay on a bed of pine boughs and filthy blankets, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her body contorted by the waves of labor. She could not have been more than 17. She was alone. The fire in the stone hearth was little more than embers, and the cold of the storm was seeping into the room. Eliza's professional instincts took over, pushing aside her fear. She dropped her bag, threw her snow-covered coat into a corner, and went to the girl's side. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, her hands gentle but firm as she assessed the situation. The baby was coming, and soon, over the next few hours, Eliza worked tirelessly, fighting to bring warmth and order to the chaotic little room. She built up the fire, boiled water, and murmured words of encouragement, her voice a steady anchor in the girl's sea of pain. The girl, whose name was Abigail, drifted in and out of a feverish state, her whispered words painting a grim, fragmented picture. A man's name was repeated, Silas. He had made promises, spoken of a new life, a home. Then came the discovery of the child, and the promises had turned to threats. She had been brought here, to this remote place, to be forgotten. The men who had left her here were supposed to care for her, but they had fled when the storm and the labor had both turned fierce. Eliza's blood ran cold. Silas. There was only one Silas of any consequence in Raven's Ford. Mayor Silas Kincaid, the town's most powerful man, its chief merchant, and the local agent for the Northridge and Pacific Railroad. A man who smiled in church on Sunday and squeezed his debtors dry on Monday. A man whose ambition was as vast and cold as the landscape itself. He was expanding his influence, making deals for land, preparing for the railroad's inevitable push through the territory. He spoke often of progress and prosperity, but the town whispered of his ruthlessness. It was said he wanted the valley known as Elk Hollow, a place the Northern Cheyenne considered sacred, and would stop at nothing to get it. Just as the baby, a boy, finally drew his first shuddering breath, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was the crunch of boots on snow, the low murmur of men's voices. Abigail's eyes grew wide with terror. "They came back," she whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "They came back to finish it." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved to the single, tiny window, a piece of greased parchment that did little to keep out the cold, and peered through a small tear. 3 riders sat on their horses just beyond the weak circle of lantern light spilling from the shack. Their faces were hidden behind dark scarves, their shapes hulking and menacing against the white fury of the storm. They were not a rescue party. They were waiting, patient as wolves. Then she saw him. At the edge of the clearing, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows of the pines. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible in the deep snow, a silence that was more profound than the noise of the storm. He was tall and lean, wrapped in a buffalo hide cloak, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not one of them. He was something else entirely, a man of this place, born of its harsh beauty and its unforgiving nature. He did not shout or make a grand gesture. He simply raised his free hand and pointed one finger at the lead rider. The gesture was simple, direct, and utterly commanding. For a long moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The riders shifted, their horses sensing the tension. The man in the shadows did not move, a statue of quiet defiance. Then, without a word, the lead rider turned his horse, and the other 2 followed. They melted back into the storm, phantoms swallowed by the night. The door creaked open, and the man from the shadows stepped inside. He pushed back the hood of his cloak, and Eliza found herself looking at the face of Cayetan 2 Moons, Kai, as he was known in the town. He was Northern Cheyenne, a scout and a warrior who walked a lonely path between 2 worlds. He traded furs at the general store and guided survey crews for pay. Yet his eyes held the untamed spirit of the plains, a wisdom that came from listening to the wind and reading the stories written in the snow. He was tolerated in Raven's Ford, but never trusted, a source of fear for some, and a subject of contempt for others. He said nothing, his dark eyes taking in the scene in an instant. The exhausted young mother, the newborn child, and Eliza, standing like a sentinel beside them. His gaze was intense, missing nothing. He moved to the hearth and added wood to the dying fire, his movements economical and precise. The flames leaped up, pushing back the shadows. He spoke, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the storm outside. Kincaid's men. It was not a question. Eliza could only nod, her throat tight. She watched as he checked the flimsy door, bracing it with a length of wood. He was creating a fortress around them, a small pocket of safety in a world that had suddenly become lethal. "Who is she?" he asked, his gaze falling on Abigail, who had slipped into an exhausted sleep. "His cousin?" Eliza replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Mayor Kincaid's cousin." Kay's expression did not change, but a new understanding flickered in his eyes. He looked from the sleeping mother to the tiny, wrinkled face of her son, and then to Eliza. He saw the tremble in her hands, the exhaustion and fear she was trying so hard to conceal beneath a veneer of professional composure. He saw that she was now part of this ugly secret, a witness Kincaid could not afford to have. The wind howled, rattling the small shack to its foundations. Outside, the Montana winter raged on, indifferent and eternal. Inside, the four of them were bound together by a desperate secret in the heart of the storm. A physician sworn to protect life, a warrior accustomed to dealing death, a forsaken mother, and a nameless babe born into a world of violence and greed. The smell of wood smoke and pine filled the air, a scent of survival. For now, they were safe. But Eliza knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the storm, that the dawn would not bring an end to their troubles. It would only be the beginning. The storm broke with the dawn, its fury spent, leaving behind a world remade in white and silence. The only sounds in the small shack were the crackle of the replenished fire and the soft, snuffing breaths of the newborn. Abigail was awake, her eyes clear and filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned away her fever. She clutched her son to her chest, a fierce, protective gesture that was at odds with the trembling of her hands. She looked at Eliza, then at Kay, who stood near the door, a silent watcher, his presence a strange mixture of threat and security. "I have to leave," Abigail whispered, her voice raspy. "They will come back. Silas will not let this rest. He will not let my boy live." Eliza's heart ached for the girl, to have gone through so much, only to face a future of running. "Where will you go?" she asked gently. "You are not strong enough to travel far." Kay spoke without turning from the doorway, his gaze fixed on the snow-laden pines outside. "She will be safe. My people will take her in. A child is a gift from the Creator. They will protect them both." Abigail's gaze shifted to him, a flicker of hope warring with a lifetime of ingrained fear of his people. But her desperation was greater than her prejudice. She knew he was her only chance. She began to struggle to her feet, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. Eliza rushed to her side, steadying her. "You need to rest," she insisted. "You need to heal." "There is no time for healing," Abigail said, her voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. She reached into the folds of her worn dress and pulled out a small, soft leather pouch, tied shut with a rawhide thong. She pressed it into Eliza's hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Take this," she pleaded. "It is all I have. It is proof." "Proof of what?" Eliza asked, her own fingers closing around the worn leather. "Of his lies. Silas made my father sign it. A contract for grazing rights in Elk Hollow. But the words are twisted. It gives him control of the whole valley when the spring thaw comes. He plans to sell it to the railroad. My father cannot read. Silas told him it was just a simple lease. He cheated him. He cheats everyone." Abigail's words came in a torrent, a confession and a condemnation all at once. She pushed the pouch harder into Eliza's palm. "Use it for my son. Do not let that man build his fortune on our ruin. Please." The weight of the small bag felt immense. A heavy stone of responsibility dropped into the placid waters of Eliza's quiet life. This was no longer just a matter of delivering a baby. This was a matter of theft, of a deep and calculated betrayal that threatened to tear the fabric of this small community apart. She looked at Kay, whose face remained impassive, but she could see in the depths of his eyes that he already knew. He had always known what men like Kincaid were capable of. Before Eliza could form a reply, Kay moved. "Now," he said softly. "The light is new. The tracks will be covered by the next wind." He opened the door, and a moment later, an old woman with a face like a wrinkled map and eyes as bright as beads slipped inside. She was one of his people, wrapped in a thick blanket, and she moved with a quiet purpose, going directly to Abigail and murmuring to her in the soft, flowing sounds of the Cheyenne language. Eliza watched as the two women helped Abigail, swaddling the baby in thick, warm furs. They treated her with a tenderness and respect that shamed the memory of the men who had abandoned her. As they led her to the door, Abigail turned one last time to Eliza. Her face was a mask of grief and gratitude. "Keep him safe," she whispered, and then she was gone, swallowed by the vast, white wilderness, leaving Eliza alone with Kay and the dangerous secret she now held in her hand. The journey back to Ravens Ford was a slow, arduous trek through a landscape of stunning, cold beauty. Kay led the way, his steps sure and steady, his knowledge of the land innate. He spoke little, but his silence was companionable, a shared understanding of the gravity of what had passed. When they finally reached the edge of town, he stopped. "The courthouse is in Bozeman," he said, his breath misting in the frigid air. 3 days' ride in good weather. In this, it would be a week, if you made it at all. And Deputy Boone works for Kincaid. His badge was bought and paid for. Giving that to him would be the same as giving it back to the man who wrote it. "Then what am I to do?" Eliza asked, her voice tight with frustration and fear. "You will do nothing," he replied. "Not yet. You will hide it. Hide it well. When the pass is clear. When the snow melts from the high country. I will take you to Fort Ellis. There are soldiers there, and federal marshals who do not take their pay from Silas Kincaid. But until then, you are a doctor. You are a teacher. That is all." He left her then, melting away toward the river as silently as he had appeared the night before. Eliza walked down the town's main street, the leather pouch now hidden deep within her medical bag. The town was stirring, smoke curling from chimneys, men shoveling paths through the deep snow. But the atmosphere was different. There was a tension in the air, a new layer of suspicion laid over the usual frontier wariness. Back in the warmth of her clinic, with the door bolted, Eliza finally opened the pouch. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a meticulous copy of a legal document, the handwriting precise and clear. She read through the complex, unfamiliar language, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not understand all of the clauses, but she understood the map that was attached, showing the entirety of the Elk Hollow Valley, and she understood the final paragraphs, which granted Silas Kincaid exclusive rights to purchase the entire parcel for a pittance, an option that became valid the moment the Northridge and Pacific announced its official survey route. It was a masterpiece of legal deception, designed to steal a sacred place from a man who could not read the words that dispossessed him. A deep sense of outrage filled her, followed by a cold wave of fear. Kay was right. This was not something she could simply hand over to the local law. Kincaid had insulated himself, using the very tools of civilization to commit a savage act of greed. Her life in Denver, the quiet routines of her clinic, it all seemed a world away. She was trapped, a lone woman in possession of a truth that could get her killed. She found a hiding place, prying up a loose floorboard beneath her bunk, a small, dark space that smelled of earth and time. She wrapped the pouch in oilcloth and placed it inside, covering it again and smoothing the rug over the spot. But even with the evidence hidden, its presence was a constant, terrifying weight in her mind. The next few days were a study in strained normalcy. Eliza held her classes, treated coughs and chilblains, and presented a calm, unremarkable face to the town. But she could feel the change. At the general store, the talk was of missing livestock, of a cache of furs gone missing from a trapper's line. The blame, guided by unseen hands, was laid squarely on the Northern Cheyenne. Whispers turned to dark muttering. Men who had traded peacefully with them for years now looked toward the hills with suspicion and anger. Then came the announcement: Mayor Kincaid, his face a mask of solemn civic duty, stood on the steps of his mercantile and declared the formation of a Ravens Ford Vigilance Committee for the safety of their homes and families. He said a group of concerned citizens would patrol the area, protecting their property from lawless savages. The committee, Eliza saw with a sinking heart, was composed of the same hard-faced men she had seen in Kincaid's employ. Men like Deputy Boone, who stood beside his mayor, hand resting on his pistol, a smug look on his face. It was not a committee for safety. It was a private army. The knock on her door came late that afternoon. It was Deputy Boone. He did not smile. He filled the doorway, his bulk blocking out the light, his presence an immediate and oppressive threat. "Afternoon, Dr. Hart," he said, his voice a low drawl that did not match the coldness in his eyes. "Just making my rounds? The mayor is concerned for your safety. What with you living all alone out here at the edge of town." "I am quite safe, Deputy. Thank you," Eliza said, keeping her voice even, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide their shaking. Boone stepped inside without being invited, his eyes sweeping the small, tidy room. His gaze lingered on her medical bag. "Heard you had a late-night call a few days back, during the storm." "I am a doctor," she replied. "My time is not my own." He took a few steps into the room, running a gloved hand along the edge of her desk, his movements a slow, deliberate violation of her space. He was looking for something. She could feel it. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The floorboard above the pouch seemed to her to be screaming its secret. "Some of the boys thought they saw tracks leading up the North Fork," he said casually. "Strange. That no one lives up that way, except maybe some of K2 Moon's relatives. You have not seen him around, have you?" Just then, a great commotion erupted outside. A horse whinnied in panic, followed by the crash of splintering wood and a string of loud, angry curses. Boone's head snapped toward the window. "What in blazes is that?" He strode to the door and pulled it open. Down the street, one of the freight wagons from the mercantile had somehow lost a wheel, spilling barrels and crates across the snowy road. Two men were shouting at each other, their argument escalating into a clumsy shoving match. It was a chaotic, disruptive scene that drew the attention of everyone nearby. Boone swore under his breath, his duty as a lawman overriding his desire to intimidate her. He gave her one last, long, searching look. "We will talk later, Doctor," he said, and the words were a clear promise, or a threat. Then he turned and stalked down the street toward the mess. Eliza quickly shut and bolted the door, her knees suddenly weak. She leaned against the solid wood, her breath coming in shuddering gasps. She looked out the window and saw, for just a moment, a figure standing in the deep shadows of the alleyway across the street. It was Kay. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone. He had created the diversion. He had been watching over her. The realization did not make her feel safe. It only confirmed how truly, deeply, and terribly in danger she was. The visit from Deputy Boone left a poisonous residue in the air of the small clinic, a threat that lingered long after he was gone. Eliza felt like a creature in a trap, aware of the steel jaws but uncertain from which direction they would snap shut. Her dwindling supply of laudanum and sterile gauze became a source of mounting anxiety. A simple infected wound or a badly broken bone could now become a death sentence without the proper materials. The temporary rail station, a full day's ride east, was the only source for resupply, but the main trail was watched. Kincaid's men were everywhere, their presence a constant, low-grade fever in the town. She was sweeping the floor 2 mornings later, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a small comfort in the tense silence, when the door opened without a knock. Kay stood there, a brace of rabbits in one hand, his face unreadable. He placed the rabbits on her small table. "You need medicine," he said. It was not a question. "I do," she admitted, "but the trail is not safe." "There is more than one trail," he answered. "The river is frozen hard. We can follow it through the canyons. No one will see us. Get your coat. We leave before the sun is fully up." There was no arguing with the quiet authority in his voice. She packed a small satchel, her medical bag, and a list of necessities. She left a note on the schoolhouse door canceling lessons for the day, citing a need to check on a sick family in a remote cabin, a plausible lie in this scattered community. The journey along the frozen river was breathtaking and terrifying. They moved through a world of white and blue, the canyon walls rising up on either side like ancient, silent giants. The ice groaned and creaked beneath the horses' hooves, the sounds echoing in the profound stillness. Kay rode ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the cliffs and the trees, reading the land like a book written in a language she was only just beginning to understand. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, he led them off the river and into a thick stand of firs. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the cold intensifying with the gathering darkness. It was then that she heard it, a sound that made the fine hairs on her neck stand on end, a long, mournful howl, answered by another, and then another, closer this time. "Wolves," she breathed, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol her father had insisted she carry, a weapon she had never fired. "They are hungry," Kay said, his voice calm. "The winter has been hard on them, too." He dismounted and began to work with a swift, practiced efficiency. He gathered a pile of dry tinder and, using a flint and steel, soon had a small, bright fire crackling to life. "Stay with the horses," he instructed her. "Keep the fire between you and the trees." He disappeared into the woods, moving as silently as a shadow. The howls grew closer, and Eliza could see fleeting shapes moving in the gloom just beyond the circle of firelight, pairs of yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast, cold silence. The horses shifted nervously, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Kay returned as silently as he had left. He carried several young pine saplings and a piece of beef tallow from his saddlebag. He showed her how to feed the green tow, resinous needles of the pine into the fire. They hissed and popped, sending up a thick, acrid smoke that billowed into the surrounding woods. The wolves, unsettled by the unnatural smell, retreated, their howls growing more distant. Then he smeared the tallow on a large stone and hurled it far into the darkness. The scent of the fat was a powerful lure. The pack, their hunger overriding their caution, moved off in the direction of the smell, their cries fading into the night. He had not simply chased them away. He had understood them, using their own nature to divert them. Eliza looked at him with a new sense of wonder. He was not just a survivor. He was a part of this wild land, and in his element, he was its master. They sat by the fire, the silence between them now comfortable, forged by the shared danger. She found herself telling him about Denver, about the fiancé she had lost. His name was Thomas, and he had been a mining engineer, a man full of laughter and grand plans. He had died in a rock slide, a casualty of a company that had cut corners on safety to dig its fortune from the mountain a little faster. She had come to Raven's Ford to escape the memory of the cloying sympathy, the whispers of the tragic doctor's bride. She had sought a place where life was stripped down to its essentials, where her skills mattered more than her story. When she finished, the fire crackled in the quiet. Kay stared into the flames, his expression somber. "My younger brother was like your Thomas," he said, his voice low. "Full of plans. He wanted to learn the white man's ways, to build a ranch, to raise cattle. He thought there could be peace. He was working with a survey crew for the railroad. Years ago, there was a dispute over pay. The foreman called him a thief. My brother was proud. He argued. The foreman's men, they were mercenaries, hired guns. They beat him. He died 2 days later. The raw pain in his simple words was a physical thing. Eliza felt a profound connection to this quiet, watchful man. They were two sides of the same coin, both wounded by the heedless greed of the world that was encroaching on this last wild frontier. His fight against Kincaid was not just about land. It was a battle against the same faceless avarice that had stolen the light from both their lives. They reached the temporary rail station the next day. It was a chaotic scar on the landscape, a jumble of tents, raw lumber, and muddy, rutted tracks. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and unwashed men. It was a place of raw, restless energy, the very tip of the spear of so-called progress. Kay waited with the horses while Eliza went into the makeshift supply depot. Inside, she found a surprising island of civilization. A long, polished bar ran the length of one wall, and behind it stood a woman with fiery red hair and intelligent, knowing eyes. This was Maeve O'Rourke, the proprietor of this traveling saloon and general store. Standing near the stove, warming his hands, was Reverend Hale, the town's stoic, graying pastor, who had ridden out to meet the supply train. "Ah, Dr. Hart," the Reverend greeted her warmly. "I trust your journey was uneventful." Eliza gave him a noncommittal smile, very aware of the other men in the room, their eyes lingering on her. She gave her list to Maeve, who gathered the items with a brisk efficiency. "A hard winter," Maeve said, her voice a low, pleasant murmur that did not carry. "Makes people mean." She slid the bottles of laudanum across the counter, wrapped in brown paper. "Heard about the new vigilance committee. Kincaid's keeping the town safe. Is he—" She gave a small, cynical laugh. "Safe for his own pockets. More like—" "What do you mean?" Eliza asked, her voice equally low. "That granary fire last week," Maeve continued, her back to the room as she counted out bandages. "The one they are blaming the Cheyenne for. My brother works the freight lines. He told me Kincaid's men were seen hauling barrels of kerosene out that way the night before. Kincaid burned his own grain, took the insurance money, and used the fire as an excuse to form a private militia and stir up hatred. He wants the Northern Cheyenne gone, or at least confined, so there is no one to protest when he takes Elk Hollow." The sheer, calculated evil of it took Eliza's breath away. Reverend Hale, who had moved closer, nodded grimly. "Silas preaches progress. Doctor," he said softly, "but he practices a very old and very dark religion. Greed." The journey back began under a sky the color of lead. The information from Maeve had settled in Eliza's stomach like a cold stone. The web of Kincaid's deceit was larger and more tangled than she had imagined. As they neared the familiar territory of Raven's Ford, Kay directed them away from the river, toward a narrow, winding pass through a jumble of jagged rocks known as Dry Needle. "It is shorter," he said, "but it is a tight space. Be ready." His words were prophetic. As they entered the narrowest part of the canyon, a shot rang out, echoing off the stone walls. A chip of rock exploded from the cliff face just inches from Eliza's head. 3 men blocked the pass ahead, rifles raised. 2 more appeared behind them, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. "Get down," Kay yelled, his voice a sharp command. He slid from his horse, pulling his rifle from its scabbard in one fluid motion. He pushed Eliza behind a large boulder, his body shielding hers, the air filled with the crack of gunfire. But Kay was not shooting to kill. He was a blur of motion, firing with a speed and accuracy that was terrifying to behold. A rifle flew from one man's hands, its stock shattered. Another man cried out as a bullet tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder. Kay's shots were precise, disabling, and deliberate. He was a warrior, but he was not a murderer. The fight was over almost as quickly as it began. 2 of the men were wounded, the others disarmed and demoralized by the sheer ferocity and skill of Kay's defense. They backed away, their bravado gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. One of them, a young man, little more than a boy, stumbled and fell as he tried to flee. Kay was on him in an instant, the muzzle of his rifle pressed against the boy's chest. The young man, whose name was Wes, squeezed his eyes shut, his face pale with terror, expecting the final, fatal shot. But it did not come. Kay looked down at him, his face a hard mask, but his eyes held something other than hatred. It was a flicker of pity, perhaps, or contempt for the weakness that had led the boy to this point. "Go," Kay said, his voice a low growl. "Tell Kincaid his dogs have no teeth." He lowered his rifle and stepped back. Wes scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something Eliza could not quite name. It was a look of confusion, of a dawning, terrible understanding of the kind of man he was working for, and the kind of man he had just tried to kill. Without a word, he turned and fled, disappearing after his companions down the rocky pass, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more ominous than before. The violent encounter in Dry Needle Pass left an invisible scar on the air of Raven's Ford. Though Kincaid's men returned with a fabricated tale of being ambushed by Cheyenne warriors, the truth festered beneath the surface. The wounded man's injury was too clean, the stock of the shattered rifle too precisely hit. It was the work of a marksman, not a chaotic skirmish. In the quiet corners of the town, a few people began to question the official story, their doubts small seeds planted in the frozen ground of fear. Reverend Hale was one of them, a man whose faith was etched not in pronouncements from the pulpit but in the quiet acts of a long and observant life. He saw the moral decay spreading through his flock like a sickness. He could not challenge Kincaid directly with force or law, for he had neither, but he possessed a different kind of authority. One evening, he sent a young boy from his sparse congregation with sealed notes for a select few. One was delivered to Eliza. It was not a summons, but an invitation to a discussion, to be held after dark in the cold, silent sanctuary of the town's only church. Eliza arrived to find the church lit by a single lantern near the altar, casting long, dancing shadows that made the empty pews look like rows of kneeling penitents. Reverend Hale stood waiting, his face grim. Maeve O'Rourke was there, her usual boisterous energy subdued into a watchful stillness, and leaning against a back pew, his arms crossed over his chest, was a man Eliza knew only by sight, Tom Cutter. He was a veteran of the war, a man with haunted eyes who now ran the hardware and fencing store. He sold the tools of settlement axes, nails, and endless spools of the barbed wire that was slowly carving up the open range. "There is a sickness in this town," the Reverend began, his voice a low rumble in the hallowed quiet. "It is the sickness of fear, and it is being fed to us by a man who profits from our division." He spoke of the granary fire, of the whispers and accusations that followed, of the way neighbor was being turned against neighbor. "This is not a court of law," he said, his gaze resting on each of them in turn. "It is a court of conscience. I have asked you here because I believe your consciences are still intact." Tom Cutter shifted uncomfortably. "I sell wire. Reverend, I do not get involved in politics." "Kincaid has contracted you to fence Elk Hollow the moment the thaw comes, has he not?" Maeve stated, her tone flat and knowing. "That is more than selling wire, Tom. That is building the walls of the cage." Cutter's face hardened. "I have a family, a son. Kincaid holds the note on my store. What would you have me do, go bankrupt for a piece of land I have never even set foot on?" Eliza felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was a man caught in the gears of a machine much larger than himself, but her sympathy was tempered by the memory of Abigail, alone and terrified in that freezing shack. "Your son is in my classroom, Mr. Cutter," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I teach him about what is right and what is wrong. What lesson will he learn if his own father helps a man steal from his neighbors?" The words hit their mark. Cutter flinched as if struck. He had no answer. The meeting ended with no resolution, but the battle lines had been drawn, not between enemies, but within the hearts of men like Tom Cutter. A few days later, Eliza received another visitor, an old Cheyenne woman named Sachi Little Elk, a midwife whose knowledge of herbs and healing was legendary among her people. Eliza had met her once before on a difficult birthing case in a remote homestead, and the two women had forged a bond of mutual respect, a quiet understanding between two practitioners of the same sacred art. Sachi entered the clinic carrying a bundle of dried roots. "For the winter coughs," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Your white man's medicine is strong, but the earth provides its own remedies." As Eliza accepted the gift, she saw the deep worry in the old woman's eyes. Sachi had been the one to guide Abigail away from the hunting shack to the safety of the Cheyenne winter camp. "The young mother," Sachi said, her voice dropping lower. "She is gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Eliza asked, her blood turning to ice. "Men came on horseback 2 nights ago, led by the man with the shiny star. They took her, and the child. They said she was a runaway and was being returned to her family. But they were rough. Their eyes were hard. They were not rescuers." The floor seemed to drop away from beneath Eliza's feet. Kincaid had found her. He had his only witness under his control. Her mind reeled. She had to act. She had to take the document and ride for Fort Ellis now, before it was too late, before Kincaid could silence Abigail forever. That night, she waited in the darkness of her clinic, her bag packed, the oilcloth-wrapped papers a heavy weight in her pocket. She was preparing to run, to take the desperate gamble Kay had warned her against. The sound of the door opening made her jump, her hand flying to her pistol. It was Kay. He stepped inside as silently as a ghost, his eyes immediately recognizing the packed bag, the frantic energy in her posture. "You cannot go," he said, his voice firm. "They have her, Kay. They have Abigail. I have to do something." "And you will. But running now, alone, is what he wants. Boone's men are watching every trail. You would not make it 5 miles. You would die in the snow, and the proof you carry would die with you." "Then what are we to do?" she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "Just wait until he wins." "We wait for the right moment to fight," he answered, his calm a steadying force against her panic. "We walk slowly so that we may go far. That paper is not enough. It is one man's word against another's. We need more. We need Tom Cutter. We need the people of this town to see the truth for themselves. Forcing their eyes open now will only make them angrier. We must let them uncover the lies on their own." He was right. Her desperate plan was born of emotion, not logic. A frantic flight into the wilderness would be suicide. She sank onto her bunk, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, heavy despair. She had failed. She had let Abigail be taken. Kay watched her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He took a step closer. "You have not failed. Eliza, you saved her life once. You gave her son a chance to be born. The fight is not over. It has just begun." His words were a small comfort, but the image of Abigail's terrified face haunted her. She reluctantly agreed to wait, to trust in his patient, methodical strategy. She unpacked her bag and returned the precious document to its hiding place beneath the floorboards, a decision that felt like a betrayal. The town continued to simmer. Small signs of rebellion began to appear. Someone painted the word thief on the door of Kincaid's mercantile in the middle of the night. The price of coal, which Kincaid controlled, became a source of open grumbling as the winter dragged on and family stockpiles dwindled while Kincaid's sheds remained full. The poorer folk, the homesteaders and laborers who lived on the margins, began to see that the mayor's vision of prosperity was meant only for himself. They saw him buying up lumber for pennies, stockpiling supplies, preparing to hold the entire town hostage to his prices once the spring thaw opened the freight routes. The fear he had so carefully cultivated was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to curdle into resentment. The true attack, when it came, was not loud or violent. It was silent, personal, and aimed at the heart of their resistance. Eliza was jolted from a restless sleep by a sound, a floorboard creaking in the main room. It was a sound that did not belong, a subtle wrongness in the familiar night noises of her small home. She lay perfectly still, her ears straining in the darkness, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. She heard a faint rustling, the whisper of cloth against wood. Her pistol was on the small table beside her bed, just out of reach. To move for it would be to announce her presence. She held her breath, feigning sleep, praying the intruder would take what they wanted and leave. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she heard the soft click of the front door latch. She waited, counting to 100, then 200, before she finally dared to move. Slipping from her bunk, she crept into the main room. The moonlight streaming through the window revealed nothing out of place. Her medicines were untouched. The small amount of cash she kept in a jar was still there. Her first thought was of the document. With trembling hands, she knelt and pried up the loose floorboard. The oilcloth package was gone. A wave of nausea and defeat washed over her. It was over. They had won. But as her fingers scrabbled in the dark, dusty space, they brushed against something else. A small, familiar object. A spare tin of carbolic soap she had stored there weeks ago. And tucked behind it, pushed deep into the corner, was the oilcloth package. She pulled it out, her relief so overwhelming it almost buckled her knees. The intruder had not found it. Then what had they taken? She looked around the room again, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. On her table, she had left the small leather pouch Abigail had given her. Now empty, it was gone. The intruder had taken the container, believing the prize was still inside. It was a foolish mistake, but a chilling one. It meant they knew what they were looking for. They knew she had the proof. Her relief was short-lived. As her gaze swept the room one last time, she saw it. On the rough log wall beside the door, drawn in crude, thick strokes of charcoal, was a picture. It was a pictograph, a symbol meant to look like the markings of a native warrior. It depicted 2 full moons, hanging side by side in a dark sky. Eliza stared at it, a cold dread seeping into her bones. It was a fabrication, a lie drawn on her wall. The symbol meant nothing to the Cheyenne. She knew enough of their ways to know that. But it was not meant for them. It was meant for the frightened people of Raven's Ford. It was a signature, a deliberately planted piece of evidence designed to point to only one person, a man who walked between 2 worlds, a man whose name was 2 moons. They had not only tried to steal the evidence, they had laid a false trail, a deadly trap meant to frame Kay for the crime and brand him an enemy of the town. The hidden war had just stepped out of the shadows. The charcoal drawing was a violation, a smear of black on the clean pine of her wall that felt more personal than a physical blow. Eliza scrubbed at it the next morning with soap and a stiff brush, but a faint, ghostly image of the 2 moons remained. A permanent stain. It was a brand, marking her as a target, and by extension, Kay. The silent war Kincaid was waging had now become public, even if only she and Kay understood the message. Fear was a cold, constant companion, but beneath it, a hard, brittle anger was beginning to form. Kay's patient strategy of waiting for the thaw now seemed like a luxury they could no longer afford. The attack on her clinic, the framing of Kay, was an escalation. It was a sign that Kincaid was growing impatient, or perhaps nervous. They needed allies, not in the spring, but now. There was only one man whose conscience they had even a sliver of a chance of awakening. They found Tom Cutter in his hardware store, the air thick with the metallic smell of cold steel and the scent of sawdust. He was measuring a length of barbed wire, his movements precise and mechanical, his face closed off. Maeve O'Rourke had joined them, her presence a gust of fiery, determined energy in the cold, quiet shop. "We need to talk." "Tom," Maeve said, getting straight to the point, no pleasantries, no preamble. Cutter did not look up. "I am busy, Maeve." "So is Kincaid," she shot back. "Busy ruining this town, busy planning to string this wire across land that is not his, your wire, Tom." Cutter finally stopped, the wire cutters hanging loosely in his hand. He looked from Maeve's determined face to Eliza's pleading one, and finally to Kay, who stood by the door. A silent, imposing figure who had not said a word. Cutter's gaze faltered. "It is just a business contract," he mumbled, his voice low and rough. "He is clearing my debt. That is all." Eliza stepped forward. "My clinic was broken into last night. Mr. Cutter, nothing of value was taken, but a message was left, a lie, meant to turn this town against Kay. It is the same lie that started the rumors after the granary fire. It is a lie that will lead to violence, and that violence will be built on a foundation of Kincaid's greed, a foundation held together by your wire." "I told you," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "I have a son to think of." "So do I," Eliza said softly. "A classroom full of them. I teach them to be honest and brave. Your boy, he is a good lad. He is bright. He deserves a father he can be proud of." The words landed like stones in the quiet store. The fight visibly drained from Tom Cutter's shoulders, leaving him slumped and weary. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong. The hands of a man who worked for a living, a man who had fought in a war for what he believed was right. He signed the contract. Cutter confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "He made me sign it the same day he offered to forgive my loan. I did not want to, but he knows how to find a man's weaknesses. He said the railroad needed progress, that everyone would be richer for it. He said the land was useless anyway." "It is not useless," a new voice said. Sachi Little Elk stood in the doorway, having approached as silently as the falling snow. Kay stepped aside to let her in, the old woman's eyes, bright and sharp, fixed on Tom Cutter. "That valley has a name older than this town, older than your fences," she said. "It is the path of the returning birds, for more generations than a white man can count. My people have marked the trail through it, a trail to our summer hunting grounds. We mark it so our children and their children will not get lost." She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out a small, flat stone. On its surface was a simple, elegant carving of a bird in flight. "The trail is marked with these signs, carved into the rocks, a map made of stone and memory. It is a sacred path, a place of history. Your laws, the federal laws, they have words to protect such places, if a man with a good heart were to speak of it." She placed the stone on the counter, a quiet, powerful testament to a world Kincaid could not understand and did not value. Tom Cutter stared at it as if it were a burning coal. The weight of his decision, of the history he was being asked to either protect or destroy, seemed to press down on him, crushing him. He did not give them an answer, but as they left the store, Eliza saw him pick up the small stone, his fingers tracing the outline of the carved bird. The existence of the trail markers changed everything. Kincaid's contract was fraud, but this was a desecration. If they could document the markers, prove the trail was an established, culturally significant site, they might be able to appeal to a higher authority than the bought and paid-for officials in Bozeman. "We have to see them," Eliza said to Kay as they walked through the snow-muffled street. "We need to know exactly where they are." Kay nodded slowly. "The trail starts near the Falls of Three Sisters. It is a dangerous place in winter. The ice is not always as thick as it looks." But they had no choice. The next day, under a sky the color of a bruised plum, they rode out, heading for the high country where the river began its long journey. The Falls of Three Sisters was a breathtaking sight. A massive curtain of water frozen into a spectacular, motionless cascade of turquoise and white ice. A narrow ledge, coated in a treacherous layer of snow-covered ice, ran along the base of the falls, the only path to the other side where the trail supposedly began. Kay dismounted. "We walk from here," he said, "one at a time. Watch my steps." He went first, moving with a sure-footed, deliberate grace, testing each step before putting his full weight down. He reached the other side and turned, waiting for her. Eliza's heart was a frantic bird in her chest. She took a deep breath and started across, her eyes fixed on the path, her hands outstretched for balance. She was halfway across when she heard it. A deep, sickening crack that seemed to come from the very heart of the ice. The ledge beneath her feet shuddered. A spiderweb of fractures appeared in the ice around her boots. Before she could even cry out, the world tilted, and she was sliding, scrabbling for purchase on the slick, crumbling surface, heading for the dark, fast-moving water that churned at the edge of the ice sheet. Kay moved faster than she thought possible. He threw himself flat on the solid ice, his arm shooting out, his hand closing around her wrist in a grip of iron just as her legs went into the freezing water. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath, her body instantly numb. The current tugged at her, trying to pull her under the ice. His face was a mask of fierce concentration, the muscles in his jaw corded with strain. He held her fast, but he could not pull her out. The angle was wrong, and his own position was precarious. "Hold on," he grunted, the words torn from him by the effort. He began to shift his weight, trying to find a better anchor, and she saw a flash of agony cross his face. A dark stain began to spread across the shoulder of his deerskin shirt, a patch of wetness that was not from the snow or the river spray. His old wound, the one from the fight with Kincaid's men years ago, had torn open under the strain. Despite the pain, he did not loosen his grip. He held her, his strength the only thing between her and a cold, dark death. With a final, desperate heave, he pulled her up, dragging her onto the solid ice. They lay there for a long moment, gasping, their breath mingling in the frigid air, the roar of the falls filling the world. She looked at his shoulder, at the blood that was now seeping through the fabric. "We have to get you out of this wind," she said, her voice shaking, her mind already shifting from victim to doctor. "We have to close that wound." He led her to a shallow cave set back from the falls, a small shelter from the relentless, biting wind. Inside, out of the worst of the storm, she built a small fire while he slumped against the rock wall, his face pale and beaded with sweat. She opened her medical bag, her fingers clumsy and numb with cold. She cut away his shirt, revealing the angry, reopened gash. The original scar was a testament to a clumsy stitching job, but the new wound was clean. The next hour was a blur of focused, intense work in the flickering firelight. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from her flask, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. She threaded a needle with gut, her own hands trembling from the cold and the lingering terror of her near drowning. As she worked, stitching the torn flesh back together, their roles were completely reversed. Here, in this small, frozen cave, he was the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one with the power to heal. He was silent and still as she worked, his eyes never leaving her face, watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with a clean strip of linen. They sat in the small circle of warmth, the blizzard howling outside, cocooned in a bubble of shared survival. The barriers between them, the ones of race and custom and fear, had been washed away by the icy water and sealed by the act of healing. As darkness fell, a shadow appeared at the mouth of the cave. They both tensed, Kay instinctively reaching for his rifle. But the figure that stepped into the firelight was not a threat. It was the boy, Wes, the young gunman Kay had spared in the pass. He was terrified, his eyes wide and haunted, and he was clutching a leather-bound ledger to his chest. "I could not do it no more," Wes stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I heard them talking. Kincaid and Boone. They were going to get rid of the girl, the one they took, make it look like an accident. And they were laughing about you," he said, looking at Kay. "Laughing about the trick with the drawing on the wall. It is not right. None of it." He thrust the ledger at Eliza. "This is Kincaid's shipping ledger. It is all in there. The extra guns, the whiskey for bribes, the payments to men who do not officially work for him. It is all there, in his own hand." Without another word, he turned and scrambled back out into the storm, a ghost returning to the night. Eliza and Kay stared at the book in her hands. It was the proof they needed. Hard, undeniable evidence of Kincaid's corruption. It was a weapon, far more powerful than a rifle. Later, as the fire burned low, they sat in silence, the weight of the day settling over them. They had faced death and had survived. They had found an unlikely ally and a powerful new truth. Eliza looked at Kay, at his strong profile illuminated by the dying embers. His shoulder was bandaged, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. She reached out, her fingers gently touching the back of his hand where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm. Beneath her touch, she felt a fine tremor, the vibration of a body pushed to its absolute limit. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and loosely entwined his fingers with hers, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the ice and the fire. The blizzard that had been a menacing backdrop at the falls became a living entity in the night, a white beast of fury that threw itself against the mountainside. The shallow cave offered little more than a psychological barrier against its power. The wind drove snow deep into their shelter, and the small fire, starved of fuel, sputtered and shrank, its warmth a fading memory. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a predator, seeping into their bones, promising a slow, quiet death. Kay stirred from a feverish doze, his body shivering despite its proximity to the dying embers. He looked at Eliza, who was huddled in her coat, her face pale and drawn in the faint, flickering light. Her hands, he noticed, were blue at the fingertips. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "The wind will kill us before the morning." "Is there anywhere to go?" she asked, her own voice thin, her teeth chattering. "We are miles from town." "There is a place, an old trapper's line cabin. Not far, over the next ridge." He began to struggle to his feet, a low groan escaping his lips as the movement pulled at the fresh stitches in his shoulder. Eliza was instantly at his side, her hand steadying him. "You cannot travel," she protested. "Your wound will tear open again. And you will freeze if we stay," he countered, his logic brutal and undeniable. His dark eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not just pain, but an unyielding will to survive. He would not die here, and he would not let her die here. The journey to the cabin was a waking nightmare. The world was a formless, roaring chaos of wind and swirling snow. Visibility was non-existent beyond a few feet. Kay led the way, a dark, stooped shape moving through the maelstrom, one hand pressed against his wounded shoulder. Eliza followed blindly, her trust placed entirely in the man ahead of her, a man who seemed to navigate by some internal compass, by the feel of the wind and the slope of the unseen ground beneath his feet. She stumbled and fell a dozen times, the snow a soft, deceptively welcoming embrace that tempted her to simply lie still and sleep. Each time, Kay's strong hand would find her, pulling her back to her feet, his voice a low command in her ear. "On your feet, doctor, not yet." After an eternity that could have been an hour or a lifetime, he stopped. A dark, solid shape loomed out of the white chaos. The cabin. It was little more than a one-room shack, half buried in a deep drift, its logs chinked with frozen mud. But it was the most beautiful sight Eliza had ever seen. The door was frozen shut, but Kay put his good shoulder to it and heaved, his face contorted with effort, until the ice cracked and the door groaned open. They stumbled inside, into a space that was as cold and dark as a tomb, but blessedly still. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a low, mournful howl outside the sturdy log walls. While Kay slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, Eliza felt her way through the darkness. Her searching hands found a stone hearth, a small stack of dry wood, and a tin box of sulfur matches. Soon, a tiny flame flickered to life, and then a proper fire, a crackling, hungry blaze that pushed back the darkness and began a valiant, losing battle against the profound cold of the room. In the growing light, she took stock of their shelter. It was sparse, but it was a haven. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools, a narrow bunk built into the wall, a few empty shelves. The trapper who had built it had left behind the essentials: a cast-iron pot, a few tins of coffee and beans, and a heavy, musty-smelling wool blanket folded on the bunk. She gently helped Kay out of his snow-caked cloak. His shirt was once again stained with blood. The journey had taken its toll, and a few of the stitches had pulled loose. She set a pot of snow on the hearth to melt, her medical training a familiar, calming ritual in the midst of chaos. "You did not have to do that," she said softly as she worked, cleaning the wound again, her touch as gentle as she could make it. "Back at the falls, you could have saved yourself." He looked at her, his eyes dark and fever-bright in the firelight. "And leave you to the river that is not my way." She finished rebandaging his shoulder, her movements efficient and practiced. He watched her the entire time, his silence more intense than any words. She was acutely aware of his gaze, of their isolation, of the storm that had cut them off from the entire world, the unspoken things that had grown between them in the dark clinic, on the frozen river, and in the icy cave, now filled the small, warm space of the cabin, an almost tangible presence. She made coffee, thick and black and bitter, and they drank it from a single tin cup they passed back and forth. The warmth spread through her, chasing away the last of the deep, dangerous chill. They sat on the stools before the fire, the ledger Wes had given them on the table between them like a holy text. "This changes things," she said, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "This is not just a fraudulent contract anymore. This is a conspiracy, bribery. He could go to a federal prison for this." "If we can get it to Fort Ellis," Kay amended, his voice low. "It is a long way, and Kincaid knows you have proof now. After the break-in, he will not let you leave this valley alive." The stark truth of his words hung in the air. Her future was not just uncertain. It was a dark, narrow path with Kincaid and his men waiting in the shadows. All her plans, her quiet life of service, her attempt to outrun the ghosts of her past, had led her here, to a snowbound cabin with a wanted man, holding a book that could either save a community or be her death warrant. She looked at Kay, at the weariness in his face, the pain he was trying to hide behind a mask of stoicism. She thought of the prejudice he faced every day, the casual contempt, the suspicion. He was a man without a true home, distrusted by her people, and a painful reminder to his own of all they had lost. And yet, in all the time she had known him, he had shown more honor and integrity than any man in Ravensford, save perhaps the Reverend. "Why do you do it, Kay?" she asked, the question surfacing from the depths of her own confusion and fear. "Why risk so much for this valley for me?" He was silent for a long time, staring into the heart of the fire. "When I was a boy," he said, "my grandfather took me to Elk Hollow in the spring. The new grass was just coming in. The whole valley was filled with elk, hundreds of them, with their newborn calves. He told me it was a sacred place, a nursery, a place of new life. He said that as long as the elk had a place to bear their young, our people would never truly die." He looked up from the fire, his gaze meeting hers, and for the first time she saw past the warrior, past the scout, and into the soul of the man. Kincaid sees timber and grazing land. The railroad sees a flat path for their tracks. When I look at that valley, I see my grandfather's face. I see those calves, taking their first steps. He paused, a shadow of pain crossing his features. "My world is disappearing. Eliza, my people are being pushed onto smaller and smaller lands. Our old ways are dying. This valley, it is one of the last places that remembers who we were. And you are a person who sees a life, a single, struggling life, and you run into a storm to save it, asking nothing in return. In my world, that is the definition of a warrior, of a leader. I risk myself for that, for a world where that still matters." His words were a revelation, a window into a grief so profound and a strength so deep it humbled her. He was afraid, not of Kincaid's guns, but of a future that had no place for him, no room for the things he held sacred. He was afraid he could not protect the memory of his grandfather, and now he was afraid he could not protect her. "This is a dangerous path I have put you on," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Back in your world, you could have a good life, a safe life, a husband, children, a warm house in the middle of town. With me, there are only trails and storms and men who want us dead." The raw honesty of his confession cracked open something deep inside her. He was offering her an escape, pushing her away for her own good. And in that moment, she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and reason, that she did not want to be pushed away. The safety of that life he described suddenly seemed hollow, a pale imitation of the vibrant, terrifying, and profoundly real existence she had found in the last few days. She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his arm, over the deerskin of his sleeve. His muscles tensed beneath her touch. "My old life is gone, Kay," she said softly. "It was buried in a rock slide in Colorado. I have been running from a ghost for 2 years. For the first time, right here, in the middle of all this danger, I feel like I have finally stopped running." He turned his head slowly, his eyes searching hers in the flickering firelight. The air grew thick, charged with the weight of everything they had survived, everything they had confessed. The storm howled outside, a wild, lonely sound. But inside the small cabin, a fragile, trembling stillness had fallen. He raised his good hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly tender. A tremor went through her. It was not from the cold. It was the vibration of a heart that had been still for too long, slowly, cautiously, beginning to beat again. They had been to the edge of death together, and in the shared journey back, had found a connection more profound than any she had ever known. He leaned in, his gaze never leaving hers, in the trembling firelit warmth, with the blizzard raging like a hungry ghost outside the log walls. His voice was so low she felt it more than heard it. "Be my sweetheart till spring," he said softly, unaware of the future, unaware of the new life that would take root in the season to come, unaware that she would one day be the mother of his son. It was not a promise of forever. It was a plea for something finite, something real in a world of uncertainty. It was a request for a shared warmth against the killing cold, a fragile truce in a long and brutal war. Eliza did not answer with words. She leaned into his touch, closing the small distance between them, and met his lips with her own. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a deep, aching tenderness. It was hesitant, gentle, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the bitter cold of the winter night. When they parted, they looked at each other. The unspoken acknowledged. The barrier finally, irrevocably, breached. "Wait for the thaw," she whispered, her voice a promise, "and we will go to Fort Ellis. Together." He nodded, a slow, solemn agreement. He took the single, heavy blanket from the bunk and draped it around her shoulders, then sat beside her, pulling a corner of it over himself. They sat there for a long time, sharing the warmth, their shoulders touching, listening to the fury of the storm as it spent its rage against their small, defiant shelter. The fire burned down to glowing embers, filling the room with a soft, red light. The ledger lay on the table, a testament to the battle that still lay ahead, but for one night, in the heart of the great, unforgiving wilderness. They had found a small pocket of peace, a fragile hope to carry them through the long, dark night, until the coming of the spring. The thaw did not come gently. It arrived with a sound like the world cracking open, a deep, resonant groan that ran the length of the river. For weeks, the ice had been the town's foundation, a solid, dependable highway. Now, it was a thing of terror, great sheets of it, acres wide, broke free with reports like cannon fire, piling up on the banks in jagged, glittering mountains or churning in the newly liberated current. A gray and grinding slurry of winter's death. The smell of damp earth, of meltwater and crushed pine, filled the air. A scent of raw, chaotic rebirth. Spring was coming, and with it, the promised confrontation. Silas Kincaid did not wait. The breaking of the river ice was the starting pistol for his final race. He understood that the window for absolute control was closing. The moment the trails to the outside world were clear, his power would be diluted by the arrival of federal marshals and the unassailable authority of the United States government. He had to consolidate his hold on Raven's Ford and on Elk Hollow before that happened. His first move was blunt and brutal. Citing the continued fabricated threat from the Cheyenne, he declared a state of emergency. Deputy Boone, now acting as the commander of Kincaid's so-called Vigilance Committee, was given the authority to enforce a town-wide lockdown. No one was to leave Raven's Ford without a pass signed by Kincaid himself. The primary instrument of this new policy was the town's wooden bridge, the sole reliable crossing over the now treacherous river. Boone and a half-dozen of Kincaid's most loyal hard cases took up a permanent, armed guard at its entrance. They sat around a smoky fire, rifles across their laps, a crude and effective symbol of Kincaid's private ownership of the town's future. The town, which had been simmering with resentment, was now cleaved in two. Kincaid's lockdown was the final, unforgivable act for a small but determined group. One evening, they gathered again, not in the church this time, but in the back room of Maeve O'Rourke's saloon, the air thick with the smell of spilled whiskey and righteous anger. Reverend Hale was there, his face set like granite. Tom Cutter, his haunted eyes now burning with a quiet resolve, stood beside him. A few other small merchants, men who had been squeezed by Kincaid's monopolistic practices, sat around the table, their expressions grim. "He has made us prisoners in our own homes," Tom Cutter said, his voice a low growl. "He has gone too far." "We have the proof," Eliza said, gesturing to the satchel at her feet where she now kept the contract and the ledger at all times. "But it is worthless if we cannot get it to Fort Ellis." "The bridge is a fortress," Maeve added, wiping a glass with a clean cloth, her movements sharp and angry. "And even if we could get across, Kincaid's men are watching the trails." While they spoke, Sachi Little Elk had dispatched a young rider to their meeting. Her message was simple. Her warriors were not seeking a fight. They had moved into the high country to guard the trail of the stone birds itself, to prevent Kincaid's men from destroying the very evidence they were trying to protect. They would avoid bloodshed, but they would not allow the sacred path to be erased. It was Kay who saw the path forward, his mind working with the patient. Strategic clarity of a hunter. He listened to the arguments, the plans of frontal assault and desperate night crossings, and then he spoke, his voice cutting through the frustrated noise. "A direct attack will fail," he said. "It is what they expect. We must make them look the wrong way. A fire cannot be put out if it is burning in two places at once." His plan was elegant in its simplicity, a design of interlocking deceptions. They needed to get a message out. A telegraph that would leapfrog Kincaid's roadblocks and bring the law down upon them. The town's only telegraph office was in the post station, a building that was, of course, being carefully watched. "Maeve, you know the telegraph codes," Kay said, his eyes fixed on her. "You must be the one to send the message." "And how am I supposed to get in there with Boone's men watching the door?" she asked. "We will give them something else to watch," he replied. The plan took shape in the smoky back room. A quiet conspiracy whispered over a poker table. Eliza's role was crucial. She took a clean roll of bandaging from her medical bag. With a bottle of ink and a fine-tipped pen, she began to draw, her hand steady. It was not a plea for help or a secret message. It was a map, a detailed, convincing diagram of the temporary rail station, with notations marking the supply depot, the saloon, the freight office. It was a document that would look, to any of Kincaid's men, like a plan for a raid. a piece of intelligence stolen from the enemy. The next afternoon, the stage was set. Wes, the young gunman who had turned his back on Kincaid, walked into the post station, his face pale but determined. His job was to create the first layer of distraction, to engage the clerk in a long, loud, and pointless argument about the cost of mailing a letter. Minutes later, Kay rode hard down the main street, his horse kicking up slush and mud. He reined in sharply near the post station, shouting for the blacksmith, claiming his horse had thrown a shoe and gone lame. It was a common enough emergency, but Kay's frantic energy was designed to draw eyes, to create a focal point of activity away from the telegraph office door. This was Maeve's cue. She walked calmly from her saloon, carrying a small, wrapped parcel. As she passed the alley beside the post station, Eliza, who had been waiting in the shadows, stepped out. They made the exchange in a heartbeat. Eliza took the innocuous parcel, and Maeve took the bandage roll, tucking it into the sleeve of her dress. Maeve walked toward the post station. Just as she reached the door, Kay, in the middle of his loud discussion with the blacksmith, let the reins of his horse slip through his fingers. The animal, agitated, bolted, galloping a short way down the street. The two of Kincaid's men who had been watching the station instinctively turned their heads, their attention drawn to the more immediate and dramatic event of the runaway horse. In that brief moment of inattention, Maeve slipped inside the post station. The final piece of the plan was the most dangerous. Eliza, holding the now visible bandage roll, began to walk quickly away from the alley, heading in the opposite direction, toward the bridge. One of Kincaid's lookouts, posted on the roof of the Mercantile, saw her. He saw the map in her hand. He shouted, pointing. "There she is, the doctor. She has the plans." It was the second fire Kay had spoken of. Suddenly, the focus of Kincaid's entire security force shifted. The doctor, the woman they had been told was the ringleader of the spies, was making a run for it, carrying what was obviously crucial intelligence. Two of Boone's men broke away from the bridge and started after her. Kay, his own diversion complete, mounted his horse and rode to intercept them, cutting them off, creating a chaotic chase scene in the middle of the muddy street. All eyes were now on the wild pursuit, on the doctor who was now running toward the river, away from the bridge. Inside the post station, the telegraph key began its frantic, unheard clicking. Maeve worked quickly, her fingers flying, sending a coded, desperate plea for help to the federal marshal at Fort Ellis. Eliza ran, her lungs burning, her feet slipping in the mud. The river was a churning, angry beast to her left. Ahead of her lay the bridge, and Deputy Boone, his face a mask of triumphant fury as he saw her running straight for him. The chase behind her was the diversion for Maeve. Her own flight toward the bridge was the diversion for what was to come next. She was 50 yards from the bridge when Kay broke off his pursuit of the other men and galloped straight for her. He did not slow down. He leaned low from the saddle, his arm outstretched. She grabbed hold, and he swung her up behind him in one powerful, fluid motion. The horse spun, its hooves digging into the soft earth, and they were no longer running from the bridge, but charging directly for it. Boone's face registered a moment of confusion, then hardened into a vicious snarl. He raised his rifle. "Stop, or I will shoot." Kay did not slow. The horse thundered toward the wooden planks of the bridge. A shot cracked through the air, deafeningly loud. A warning! The bullet splintered the wood of a railing post just beside Kay's head. He did not flinch. His own rifle, which had been resting across his lap, came up. Eliza felt the coiled tension in his body, the absolute focus of the hunter. The crowd that had gathered to watch the chase now stood in horrified silence. Men and women stood frozen on the boardwalks, their daily chores forgotten. Tom Cutter and Reverend Hale were among them, their faces pale and taut. Boone aimed again, this time taking his time, a cruel smile on his lips. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Kay's rifle fired a fraction of a second before Boone's. But his aim was not for the man's chest or his head. There was a sharp, metallic clang. The rifle in Boone's hands flew from his grasp, spinning through the air. Its stock shattered. Boone cried out in shock and pain, staring at his tingling, empty hands. Kay had not sought to kill. He had sought to disarm. He had answered a threat of lethal violence with a demonstration of superior skill, a statement of principle made with a single, perfectly placed bullet. Their horse clattered onto the bridge, past the stunned and disarmed deputy. For a moment, it seemed they were free. But one of Boone's other men, emboldened by panic, raised his own pistol. He fired wildly, the shot unaimed, a desperate act of violence in the chaotic moment. The bullet did not find Kay or Eliza. It found Tom Cutter's young son, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the terrifying spectacle with wide, frightened eyes. The boy gave a small, surprised cry and crumpled to the ground. A collective gasp went through the crowd. A single, unified sound of horror, the noise of the chase, the shouting, the gunfire. It all ceased, replaced by a profound and terrible silence. Tom Cutter screamed his son's name and ran to him, falling to his knees in the mud. The townspeople of Ravensford stared, not at Kay and Eliza, who had now cleared the bridge, but at the small, still form on the ground. They looked at the gunman, his face a mask of disbelief and terror at what he had done. And then they looked at Deputy Boone, and beyond him, toward the mercantile where Silas Kincaid stood watching from his balcony. The veil had been torn. This was not about protecting the town. It was not about law and order. It was about greed, and a brutality that had just spilled the innocent blood of one of their own children onto the muddy street. In that one horrific moment, the town of Ravensford finally, truly, awoke. The shot that struck Tom Cutter's son was the sound of a spell breaking. For months, Ravensford had been held in a thrall of fear and suspicion, a winter-long enchantment woven by Silas Kincaid. Now, the sight of a child's blood in the mud, spilled by the very men who claimed to be protectors, shattered the illusion completely. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals. It was a single, unified body, its collective breath held in a gasp of shared horror. Across the bridge, Eliza felt the horse shudder to a halt. She looked back at the scene, at the small figure on the ground, at the stunned, silent town. The path to Fort Ellis was open. They had won their escape, but as she looked at the faces of the people, she saw that escape was no longer the victory she had sought. Leaving now would be an abdication, a desertion of the very community she had sworn to serve. Justice could not be imported from a fort. It had to be born, right here, in the muddy heart of the town square. "We are going back," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Kay looked at her, his face a hard mask of concern. "Eliza, it is a hornet's nest." "I know," she said, "but the hornets are finally awake. They need to know who stirred the nest." She met his gaze, and he saw in her eyes not the fear of a hunted woman, but the resolve of a doctor running toward the wounded. He gave a single, sharp nod, and turned the horse around. Their return was an act of profound defiance. They rode back across the wooden bridge, past the stunned and leaderless gunmen, past the disarmed and humiliated Deputy Boone. The crowd in the square parted before them, a silent, human sea creating a path. They did not ride to the clinic, but to the center of the square, to the very spot where the boy had fallen. Eliza slid from the horse before it had even stopped, her medical bag in hand. She knelt in the mud beside Tom Cutter, who was cradling his son, rocking back and forth, his face a mess of tears and disbelief. The bullet had gone through the boy's leg, a clean but bloody wound. As Eliza worked, cutting away the trouser leg, applying a tourniquet, her movements swift and sure, a hush fell over the square. This was her true authority, an expertise born of healing, not of violence. "He will live." "Tom," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the unnatural quiet, "the bone is not shattered. but he needs care. Now. She looked up, not at Tom, but at the entire town, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the homesteaders, the merchants, the wives, and the laborers. And then she looked up at the balcony of the mercantile, where Silas Kincaid stood, his face a pale mask of rage and disbelief. "This is the price of your progress. Mayor Kincaid," she shouted, her voice ringing with an anger that was cold and pure. "The blood of our children in the street." She stood up, leaving the boy in the care of his father. From her satchel, she pulled Kincaid's ledger and the fraudulent contract. She held them high for all to see. "Here is the rest of the price," she declared. "A contract built on lies. To steal a valley from men who trusted you, a ledger filled with your crimes, bribery, secret payrolls. The kerosene you used to burn your own granary so you could blame innocent men." Maeve O'Rourke stepped forward from the crowd. "It is true," she yelled. "He burned it for the insurance, and to start this reign of terror, I have the freight manifests to prove it." Tom Cutter, his face streaked with his son's blood, staggered to his feet. "And I have the contract for the wire. He forced me to sign it, threatening to ruin me if I did not help him fence Elk Hollow. He is a thief and a bully." Kincaid's face contorted, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "This is slander, lies, and insurrection." As if in answer, a path opened in the crowd, and Sachi Little Elk walked through, her face as serene and implacable as the mountains. And beside her, holding a swaddled baby in her arms, was Abigail. The young woman was trembling, her eyes wide with terror, but she did not falter. She walked to the center of the square and stood beside Eliza. "He is my cousin," Abigail whispered, her voice a thin, fragile thread that nonetheless carried across the silent square. "He sent me away to die in the snow because I carried his child. He sent his men to silence me, to silence my son." The sight of the young mother and her baby, the living proof of Kincaid's most personal and cruel betrayal, was a blow from which his reputation could not recover. The last vestiges of his authority crumbled into dust. Seeing the walls closing in, Kincaid made his last, desperate move. He gave a frantic, almost imperceptible signal to a man lurking near his warehouse down the street. A moment later, a thin curl of smoke began to rise from the building's roof. He was trying to burn the evidence, to destroy the records that would corroborate the ledger. But the smoke quickly thinned and died. From the alley beside the warehouse, Wes appeared. He looked across the square and gave a single, almost invisible nod to Kay. He had disabled the trigger, fulfilling his final act of penance. Trapped and exposed, Kincaid fell back on his last resort brute force. "Arrest her!" he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Eliza. "Arrest them all for treason." Deputy Boone, his face a dark thundercloud of humiliation, drew his pistol and started toward Eliza. His men, hesitant and unnerved by the turn of events, shuffled behind him. But before Boone could take 2 steps, Reverend Hale moved to stand directly in Eliza's path. His face, usually so mild and scholarly, was now a study in righteous iron. "Not today, Deputy," the Reverend said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Then Tom Cutter, leaving his son in the care of Maeve, stood beside the Reverend. And then 2 of the other merchants joined them. And then a blacksmith, his hammer still in his hand. And then their wives. A wall of ordinary people, unarmed but resolute, formed a living shield in front of Eliza. Enraged, Boone shoved the Reverend aside. "You cannot stop the law," he roared, and lunged for Eliza. He never reached her. Kay moved with a blur of speed, a silent, fluid predator intercepting its prey. He did not draw his rifle. He met Boone's charge head-on. The deputy was a bigger man, fueled by rage, and he threw a clumsy, powerful punch. Kay deflected it easily, using Boone's own momentum against him. He twisted, his body moving with a dancer's grace and a fighter's deadly purpose. He spun behind Boone, his arm snaking around the deputy's neck, his other hand locking onto his own wrist. It was not a killing blow. It was a hold of absolute control, an application of skill over brute strength. Boone struggled for a moment, his face turning a dark red, his hands clawing uselessly at the arm that held him. Then his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp. Kay lowered him gently to the ground, unconscious but alive. The town's tyrant lay subdued in the mud, defeated not by a bullet, but by a quiet, implacable justice. With Boone down, his remaining men faltered, looking from their fallen leader to the silent, watching crowd, and then to the lone, terrifying figure of Silas Kincaid on his balcony. The spell was well and truly broken. A single voice, rough and anonymous, rose from the crowd. "Hold the mayor! Do not let him escape!" The cry was taken up by others, a hesitant murmur at first, then a rising chorus of voices finding their courage. They were no longer a mob. They were a citizenry, demanding accountability. And then another sound, clear and resonant, cut through the air, the deep, solemn tolling of the church bell, rung by the Reverend's young son. It was not an alarm, but a proclamation, a sound of judgment, of a moral reckoning arriving at last for Ravensford. At the very peak of this standoff, as Kincaid stood trapped on his balcony and the town found its collective voice, a new sound intruded, the rhythmic beat of horses' hooves, disciplined and steady. A column of blue-coated soldiers, their uniforms crisp, their carbines held at the ready, rode into the square. At their head was a captain from Fort Ellis, a man with a hard, lean face and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted, holding a piece of paper in his gloved hand. The telegraph from Maeve. His gaze took in the entire tableau in a single, sweeping glance, the wounded boy being tended by a cluster of women, the unconscious deputy on the ground, the armed but uncertain vigilance committee, the defiant crowd, and the pale, trembling figure of the mayor on his balcony. "Mayor Silas Kincaid," the captain's voice boomed, sharp and official, cutting through the lingering tension. "By the authority of the United States Army and the Territorial Marshal's Office, you are hereby suspended from your duties pending a full investigation into charges of fraud, incitement, and conspiracy. Your assets are seized, and this town is under the temporary jurisdiction of Fort Ellis." The soldiers dismounted, moving with a quiet, efficient purpose to secure the mercantile and disarm the last of Boone's men. Two of them ascended the stairs to the balcony and took a stunned, speechless Silas Kincaid into custody. The long, hard winter was finally over. The ice had broken, not just on the river, but in the hearts of the people. Spring had come to Ravensford. The departure of Silas Kincaid and Deputy Boone was not a triumphant event. There were no cheers, no celebrations in the street. It was a quiet, almost solemn exodus. The soldiers from Fort Ellis led them away in chains, their faces pale and slack, the arrogance and menace stripped from them, leaving behind only two diminished, defeated men. The town of Ravensford watched them go in a profound, collective silence, the silence of a people waking from a long and terrible fever, exhausted and blinking in the unfamiliar light of a new day. In the wake of their removal, a vacuum of power was left, but it was not filled with chaos. Instead, something remarkable happened. The fear that had divided them, that had made them suspicious of their neighbors and hostile to strangers, had been burned away by the events in the square. What remained was a shared sense of shame and a fragile, newly forged sense of community. The first town meeting was held 3 days later, not in the mercantile, but in the church, with Reverend Hale presiding. It was not a formal election, but a simple coming together of people who knew something had to be done. Tom Cutter, his son's leg bandaged and propped on a stool, was the first to speak. His voice, usually so hesitant, was clear and steady. "I was a coward," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. "I was afraid of being ruined, and I nearly helped ruin all of us. I cannot take back the fear, but I can take back this." He held up the contract he had signed with Kincaid, the agreement to fence Elk Hollow. In the quiet of the church, he tore the document in half and then in half again. The sound of the ripping paper, a small, sharp declaration of independence. "The path to the valley stays open," he said, and sat down. A provisional town council was formed that day, a simple committee of 3. Reverend Hale was chosen for his moral compass, Maeve O'Rourke for her sharp mind and knowledge of the world beyond their small valley, and Tom Cutter for his newfound courage and his connection to the common man. Their first act was to formally dissolve the Vigilance Committee and send a message of peace and reconciliation to the Northern Cheyenne. Life in Ravens Ford began to find a new rhythm, centered not around the mercantile and its ledgers of debt, but around the 3 small buildings that had become the town's heart. Eliza's schoolhouse was once again filled with the noisy chatter of children, their lessons now subtly infused with stories of courage and the importance of speaking the truth. Her clinic, in the evenings, became an informal gathering place for the women of the town, who came with their sick children or their own ailments, and stayed to talk, to share their worries and their hopes, weaving the frayed social fabric of the community back together. Maeve's Saloon, once a place of tense whispers and solitary, hard-eyed drinkers, transformed into the town's forum. Men gathered not just to drink, but to argue and debate the future. They talked of forming a proper cooperative to buy supplies, of petitioning the territory for a real, elected sheriff, of how to build a town that would belong to all of them, not just to one powerful man. The true sign of the changing season, however, came with the rebirth of the spring market. It was an old tradition that had died out under Kincaid's suffocating control. Now, with the thaw complete and the trails clear, it was revived. Homesteaders brought in their winter furs and their first crops of spring greens. The blacksmith set up a temporary forge, his hammer ringing a cheerful, busy rhythm through the square. And for the first time in years, the Northern Cheyenne came down from the high country not as objects of suspicion, but as partners in trade. Sachi Little Elk presided over a stall filled with her potent herbal remedies, her quiet dignity a powerful presence. Other families displayed lustrous, soft-tanned deer hides and buckskins, and beautifully dyed porcupine quills, their colors as vibrant as the new wildflowers that were beginning to dot the hillsides. The exchanges were fair, the talk was respectful, and the old, unspoken enmities began to dissolve in the bright, clear air of the new season. Amidst this public healing, a private story was quietly unfolding. As the days grew longer and the valley turned from a stark white and brown to 1,000 shades of green, a subtle change had come over Eliza. A new kind of weariness settled in her bones in the evenings, a fatigue that was different from the exhaustion of fear and stress. There was a new tenderness in her body, a heightened awareness of her own physical being that was both strange and wonderful. One clear, cool evening, when the last of the market stalls had been packed away and a sliver of a new moon hung in the twilight sky, she sought out Kay. He was by the river, watching the now peaceful current, his presence as calm and steady as the ancient stones on the bank. She had not seen as much of him since the soldiers had arrived. He had faded back to the edges of the town, his work done, as if he were uncomfortable in the very peace he had helped to create. "Walk with me," she said, and it was not a question. He fell into step beside her without a word, and they walked away from the town, following the river upstream. The air was sweet with the scent of cottonwood buds and damp earth. They did not speak for a long time, the silence between them filled with the comfortable weight of all they had shared. They walked the familiar path toward the high country, toward the place where their story had truly begun. The Falls of Three Sisters was a different creature in the spring. The silent, frozen sculpture of winter was gone, replaced by a thunderous, living spectacle. 3 massive columns of water plunged over the cliffs, sending a cloud of fine, cool mist into the air. The roar a deep and constant celebration of the river's power. The treacherous ice ledge where she had almost died was gone, and in its place, a carpet of brilliant green moss and tiny, star-like flowers clung to the wet rock. They stood before it, The sheer, raw power of the place, a humbling reminder of the forces that governed their world. Forces far older and greater than the petty ambitions of men like Silas Kincaid. "I was so afraid that day," Eliza said, her voice almost lost in the roar of the water. "I know," Kay replied, his eyes on the cascade. "So was I." It was the first time she had ever heard him admit to fear, and the simple confession was more intimate than any embrace. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a simple strip of blue ribbon, a spare piece she had saved from her sewing kit. "For our promise," she said, holding it out to him. He took it from her, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He found a young, hardy sapling that had taken root in a crack in the rock face near the falls. A small, tenacious life thriving in a dangerous place. Together, their hands touching, they tied the ribbon around one of its slender branches. The blue fabric fluttered in the wind and the spray, a tiny, bright flag of hope against the vast, wild backdrop of the falls. It was a symbol of their quiet vow, made in the heart of the storm, a promise not of forever, but of a shared path, until the spring. But spring was here now, and the promise had taken root, just like the sapling. They stood there for a long moment, watching the ribbon dance, their shoulders touching. The future was still an unknown country. The trial in Bozeman would be long and difficult. Building a new life between their two worlds would be a constant negotiation, a balancing act on a wire strung between two very different cliffs. But for the first time, the future did not seem like a threat. It felt like a possibility. Eliza placed her hand over her own belly, a small, unconscious gesture. She felt the profound and subtle shift within her, the secret she had been holding for the past 2 weeks, a truth she had only just fully admitted to herself. She turned to Kay, a slow, shy smile touching her lips. The roar of the falls was all around them, a great, thunderous heartbeat of the earth itself. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, so her words would not be stolen by the wind. "I think," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, breathtaking wonder, "that there is another little heartbeat besides my own." Kay went very still. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face, and in them, she saw a wave of emotion so powerful it almost took her breath away. Shock, disbelief, a profound, gut-wrenching fear. And then, beneath it all, a slow, dawning light of a joy so fierce and so unexpected it was akin to a revelation. He did not speak. He simply raised his hand, the one that had pulled her from the icy water, and laid it gently against her stomach, a gesture of such infinite tenderness and awe that it was more eloquent than any words could ever be. The roar of the water surrounded them, a wild and powerful lullaby for a new life, conceived in the heart of winter and promised to the spring. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the space between them. The thunder of the falls a distant echo to the silent, seismic shift that had just occurred. Kay's hand on her belly was a brand of impossible warmth, a claim and a question and a prayer all at once. In his eyes, she saw the wild, untamed landscape of his soul, a place that had known so much loss. Now confronted with the terrifying, brilliant prospect of new life, he did not need to speak. She understood the fear that laced his joy. How could he offer a safe world to a child when he himself had to walk so carefully between two of them, and he saw in her quiet, steady gaze the answer they would build that world together, one day at a time, just as they had survived the winter. The journey back to Raven's Ford was different from all the others that had come before. They were no longer fugitives, but architects of a fragile peace, carrying a secret that was both a private joy and a public complication. Spring had truly arrived in the valley, a riotous, unrestrained explosion of life. The cottonwoods along the river fuzzed with green. The hillsides were painted with the vibrant, fleeting colors of wild crocus and buttercups, and the air itself felt clean and new, scrubbed free of the winter's lingering chill. Weeks turned into a month, and the news from the world beyond their valley trickled in. carried by the mail riders who could now travel the passes with ease. The case against Silas Kincaid and his men had been taken from the territorial courts and elevated to the federal level. Kincaid's crimes, it turned out, were not just against the people of Ravens Ford, but against the United States government itself. The shipping ledger Wes had provided was a treasure map of corruption, detailing illegal arms shipments, bribery of federal land agents, and a systematic conspiracy to defraud the Northridge and Pacific Railroad. Sachi Little Elk was called to Bozeman to give testimony. She went not as a frightened witness, but as an ambassador of her people, carrying with her a collection of the stone bird markers, her quiet dignity, and the unassailable truth of the ancient trail, leaving a deeper impression on the court than any of Kincaid's frantic, self-serving lies. Kay went with her, not to speak, but to stand as a silent testament to the lives that had been threatened. His presence a powerful reminder of the human cost of Kincaid's ambition. The verdict, when it finally came, was decisive. Silas Kincaid was sentenced to a long term in a federal penitentiary, his assets forfeited, his name erased from the town he had sought to own. Deputy Boone and the others who had followed him received lesser sentences, their loyalty to a corrupt man costing them their freedom. But the most significant victory was not the punishment of the guilty, but the protection of the innocent. In a landmark ruling, citing the historical evidence of the stone markers and the cultural testimony of the Northern Cheyenne elders, Elk Hollow was designated as a protected heritage site. It was a victory of memory over money, of sacredness over speculation. The path of the returning birds would remain open forever. The invisible map of Sachi's ancestors had been formally drawn onto the official maps of the United States, a permanent line that greed could never again erase. With the legal battles won, Ravens Ford turned its full attention to the difficult, joyful work of rebuilding itself. The new town council, with Maeve's pragmatism, the Reverend's steady hand, and Tom Cutter's earnest humility, guided the town not with edicts, but with discussions. They organized a work crew to repair the bridge, a volunteer effort where men who had recently stood on opposite sides of a divide now worked shoulder to shoulder. The shared labor of hammering and sawing a better remedy for bad blood than any amount of talking. The Spring Festival was the culmination of this new spirit, a celebration not just of the changing of the season, but of their own survival and rebirth. The Main Street, once a muddy track of fear and suspicion, was now a vibrant artery of life. The sound of a banjo, played with more enthusiasm than skill by the blacksmith, provided a cheerful, rhythmic heartbeat for the day. Tables were laden with food venison stew and fresh-baked bread, jars of preserved berries from the previous summer, and the first tender greens from the homesteaders' gardens. Children, released from the confines of the long winter, were a whirlwind of joyous energy. Tom Cutter's son, his leg now healed to a slight, proud limp that he showed off as a war wound, led a gang of his friends in a wild chase through the square. They were pursuing ribbons, bright strips of colored cloth tied to the ends of willow sticks, their laughter a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness that was more valuable than all the gold Kincaid had ever hoped to possess. Eliza sat on a bench in front of her clinic, a quiet observer of the scene. She was several months along now, her condition a gentle, visible curve beneath her simple dress, an open secret that the town had accepted with a quiet, protective grace. The women would bring her small gifts of food, an extra cup of broth or a particularly sweet apple, patting her shoulder with a knowing, maternal kindness. The men, even the roughest of them, would quiet their voices and doff their hats as they passed. Her child, this child of two worlds, had been claimed by the community before it had even drawn its first breath. Kay stood beside the bench, not sitting, but remaining a tall, watchful presence at her side. He said little, but his eyes followed her every move, a constant, grounding reassurance. He had built them a small cabin, just upriver from the town, on a piece of land that was neither part of the settlement nor part of the reservation, a small kingdom of their own that belonged only to them. He had built it with his own hands, the logs fitting together with a craftsman's precision, the hearth drawing clean and true. It was a simple, sturdy structure, a promise made real in wood and stone. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the square, Kay reached down. He did not take her hand. Instead, he gently touched his fingertips to her forehead, a gesture of profound and quiet intimacy. It was a blessing, a greeting, and a promise, all in one. Eliza closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, a slow smile spreading across her face. They did not need many words anymore. They had lived a lifetime together in the space of a single, brutal winter. They had seen the worst of each other's worlds and the best of each other's hearts. The future was still unwritten, a path that would have its own stones and its own storms. But they would walk it together. She thought of his words, whispered in the heart of the blizzard, in the desperate warmth of the trapper's cabin. "Be my sweetheart till spring." It had been a plea for a temporary truce, a fragile shelter against the cold. But standing here now, in the full, glorious light of the season, with the sound of music in the air and their child growing safely within her, she understood that the words had transformed. The spring was no longer an ending, a deadline for a temporary affection. It was a beginning. It was not just a season. It was a promise that had come to life, a permanent state of being, a new and hopeful world they had built together out of the wreckage of the old one. Love, she realized, was not a grand, dramatic event. It was a quiet, stubborn thing, like a sapling taking root in a rock crevice, a small, persistent green that could, with enough courage and enough light, break the stone itself. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Old West. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please consider subscribing to our channel Wild West Tales, liking the video, and pressing the hype button to help more people hear this story.